The chamber smelled like old power. Ambassador Cale Draven had been sitting in it for 11 years, and he still noticed the smell every single time. Something between ozone and incense, and the particular staleness of air that had been recycled through alien lungs for too long. The Galactic Council's main hall on Varath Station was built to impress, and it did. Ceilings that went up 40 meters, walls carved from a single piece of pale blue mineral that no human geologist had ever been allowed to properly study. Light sources that weren't quite lights, just a soft glow that came from everywhere and nowhere, and made everyone look slightly holy. Everyone except the humans. Draven always thought the light made him look like he'd been awake for 3 days, which, today, he had been. He sat in the observer's tier, third row back, left side, slightly obscured by one of the decorative columns that the architects had placed with the specific genius of people who'd never had to actually watch a debate from there. Earth's designated seat. For 200 years, whoever held the title of human ambassador to the Galactic Council had sat in this exact chair, in this exact spot, and watched the galaxy make decisions without them. He adjusted his jacket, checked his water glass, checked it again. Around him, the chamber was filling. The Varrock delegation arrived in their customary formation, 3 abreast, military straight even in civilian robes, their gray-green skin carrying that faint bioluminescent pulse that meant they were alert and watching. The Teln came in a cluster, their translator devices already murmuring as they debated among themselves in overlapping harmonics. The Sorvathi arrived last, as they always did, because they believed that being last made you look like you had better things to do. Draven watched them all settle. He knew the seating arrangements the way a man knows the layout of a house he grew up in, not by thinking, just by knowing. He'd spent 11 years learning this room, the alliances that shifted depending on the agenda. Which species watched Von Sale before they voted? Which ones made a show of independence and then voted with the bloc anyway? Which delegate ate something crunchy during recesses and pretended not to? He knew this room better than most of the people in it. They had no idea. High Arbiter Von Sale arrived at exactly the formal hour, as he always did, because High Arbiters did not arrive early and did not arrive late, and the distinction was apparently something the Sorvathi had written 3 volumes about. He was tall even for his species, with the deep blue-black coloring that indicated high family lineage, and he moved through the chamber with the loose comfort of a man who had never once wondered whether he belonged in a room. He'd held the position of High Arbiter for 60 years. Before that, his predecessor had held it for 90. The position had been, for all practical purposes, a family inheritance wearing the costume of an elected office. He didn't look at Draven. He never did, in any way that acknowledged Draven's presence as something requiring acknowledgement. Draven drank his water and waited. The first hour was what the council called procedural review, which meant each delegation reported on things that had already happened and then agreed, formally, that they had happened. It was the political equivalent of a receipt. Draven had long ago stopped taking notes during this section, and instead spent it doing mental arithmetic about nothing in particular. Today he calculated, for no reason he could name, approximately how many cups of coffee he had consumed in this building over 11 years. He got to somewhere around 4,000 and lost count. The second hour was open agenda, which meant species could raise issues they wanted formally discussed. The Teln raised concerns about a disputed asteroid belt in the Kavar system, which had been raised and tabled and raised again for 6 consecutive summits. The Varrock delegation raised a point about military transit lanes near the outer rim. The Sorvathi wanted to discuss trade certification protocols that Draven suspected would take the rest of the day and resolve nothing. None of this touched humanity. Nothing in the open agenda ever did. That was the point of the observer tier. You observed. Then Von Sale raised one hand, just slightly, a gesture that in Sorvathi culture indicated a matter of some personal weight, and the chamber quieted. Draven's water glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The matter of human administrative classification, Von Sale said, has come due for its decennial review. I would ask the chamber's indulgence to address it now rather than in the formal review period, as it has some logistical dependencies. Logistical dependencies. Draven set his glass down without drinking. He knew what was coming. He'd known for 3 months. His source inside the Sorvathi administrative office wasn't someone he'd recruited, just someone who had eaten lunch near him long enough to have a conversation, and then another, and who had eventually said, with the careful indirectness of a species that considered directness a form of aggression, that the Council's inner caucus had been discussing whether humanity's observer credentials needed recalibration. Recalibration, another word for tightening the leash. He'd been waiting to see how they'd frame it. Our current classification system, Von Sale continued, places humanity in Category 7 observer status. This was established as a provisional arrangement 183 years ago, with the understanding that the arrangement would be revised as human civilization matured. Matured, as though they were a fruit someone was waiting to go soft. Recent assessments by the Administrative Subcommittee indicate that Category 7 status, while appropriate at establishment, may in fact be more generous than the current data supports. He clasped his hands, long blue-black fingers interlaced. Human populations occupy 17 colonial systems. Their interstellar travel capacity remains sublight plus. Their participation in council proceedings has been, by all metrics, observational only. This was all true. Draven had ensured it looked true. The subcommittee's recommendation is a reclassification to Category 9, with corresponding adjustment to access protocols, observer rights, and the communication permissions currently held by the human diplomatic mission. Category 9. That was, he ran the institutional knowledge quickly, one tier above a pre-contact civilization. They'd be sitting in this room with the same effective status as a species that didn't know the council existed yet. Less access to session records, restricted communication bandwidth, required pre-clearance for any formal statement. A muzzle with paperwork. Around the chamber, delegates were doing what delegates do, checking with their nearest colleagues, murmuring, calculating what this meant for them. The Varrock delegation was still. The Teln were murmuring to each other in their harmonic overlaps. A few smaller species were watching Draven. He was aware of Commander Esh watching him from the Varrock section. Esh was not like most of the Varrock Draven had met. The Varrock, as a rule, were professional without being curious. They ran their military protocols with precision and their diplomacy like a logistics problem, and they were usually predictable in the way that well-maintained machines were predictable. Esh had been part of the Varrock delegation for 4 years. In that time, he had asked Draven questions, not polite questions, real ones. What does Earth look like from orbit? What did humans do before space travel? What does a human actually eat? He'd seemed genuinely interested in the answers. Now Esh was watching Draven with an expression that in a human face would read as wariness. Draven gave him nothing back, not a nod, not a shrug, not a frown. He kept his face in the mild, slightly bored expression he'd spent 11 years perfecting. The debate took 40 minutes. Most of it was administrative theater, delegations asking clarifying questions about the classification criteria, Von Sale's aide providing answers from prepared documents, a brief exchange between 2 Teln delegates that the translators rendered as something about precedent. A small species delegate from the Hervek Compact asked whether reclassification would affect human access to emergency medical protocols, which was the closest thing to an objection anyone raised. Von Sale answered that question with reassuring language that did not actually answer the question. Draven listened, took no notes, kept his breathing steady. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had with Admiral Osei 6 months ago, standing in a construction bay carved out of a rock 40 light minutes from the nearest shipping lane. They'd been looking at the 3rd ship in the fleet, hull still open in sections, drive core not yet sealed, engineering teams moving in the dark like ants on something too large to see all at once. Osei had asked him, very quietly, when he thought they should move. He'd told her, when they move first. She'd looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, then gone back to talking to her engineers. The vote in the chamber came to a show of delegation markers. Procedural votes in the council didn't require extensive ceremony. Von Sale's aide counted, announced the result. Humanity was now Category 9. Draven picked up his water glass and finished it. One of the junior human diplomatic staff, a young woman named Torres who'd been in the mission for 8 months and still occasionally looked surprised by things, leaned toward him. "Ambassador," she said quietly. "What do we do?" He set the glass down, considered. "Nothing," he said. "In here." She waited. He didn't elaborate. The session moved on to the Sorvathi trade certification protocols, as he'd expected. Draven sat through it with the patience of a man who has already made all his decisions and is simply waiting for the universe to catch up. The recess came at the 3rd hour mark. The chamber lights shifted slightly to indicate a break. Delegates moved toward the side chambers where refreshments were served, a practice that looked social but was almost entirely political, since who stood near whom during recess was its own form of communication. Draven stayed in his seat for 2 minutes. Then he walked to the outer corridor. It was quieter there. The corridor ran around the perimeter of the main chamber, windows on the outer wall showing Varath Station's dock ring, and, beyond it, The star the station orbited, a dim red dwarf that gave everything outside a faint rust-colored light, like late afternoon in a very tired city. He stood at the window. He could hear, distantly, the sound of Commander Esch stepping up beside him. He'd expected it. "Category 9, Esch said. "Not a question. Apparently, you don't seem concerned." "I'm not." Esch was quiet for a moment. He was the same height as Draven, which was unusual for Varrock. Most of them ran taller. He had the deep-set eyes common to his species, dark and slightly reflective, like polished stone. "You've been in that chamber for 11 years, Esch said. "I've been here for 4. In those 4 years, every time something goes wrong for your delegation, you sit still, you don't object, you don't file counter-documentation, you just wait. Patience is a tactic." "It's only a tactic if there's something you're being patient toward." Esch looked at him. "Is there?" Draven looked at the rust-colored star. There was a version of this moment where he said something diplomatic, something deflecting, the version he'd been performing for 11 years. "Yes," he said instead. He watched Esch process that, the small stillness in the Varrock officer's posture that meant something had shifted. Then Draven's internal calm gave a single, silent vibration against his wrist, the one he'd set as a specific signal for a specific contact. He looked down. Read the confirmation. His diplomatic staff had filed the formal acknowledgement of the reclassification, a procedural requirement, automatic, no one would look at it twice. And alongside it, embedded in the metadata of that filing, a packet of encrypted code had gone out to a relay beacon that humanity had parked, very quietly, in the outer dark 3 years ago. 2 words. "Wake them." "I need to make a call," Draven told Esch. He walked back toward the human diplomatic suite without looking back at the window, or at Esch, or at the rust-colored star outside. He made 3 calls. None of them were the one he'd said he needed to make. The first was to Torres, telling her to compile the full text of every treaty, agreement, and resolution that had been filed against human activity in the last 2 centuries. He needed it organized by which ones named humanity, explicitly in their jurisdiction clauses. She asked why. He said, "Because it matters which ones do and which ones don't." The second call was to the Human Missions Administrative Liaison, a small office that handled the paperwork between Earth's diplomatic corps and Council infrastructure. He told them to begin preparing a formal statement to be filed at the start of the next full session. Not today, not tomorrow, when he told them. The third call was brief, a channel he hadn't opened in 4 months, Admiral Osei's private line. She answered on the second tone. "Draven. It's done," he said. "Category 9. A pause, not surprise. She'd known it was coming. The pause was something else, the thing a person does when a plan that has taken 40 years finally starts moving. "Understood," she said. "You have the signal?" "Received it 11 minutes ago. They're already running the startup sequence. Full power in." He heard her check something. "Approximately 6 hours. 6 hours. 17 ships, waking up for the first time in earnest. 40 light minutes from the nearest inhabited station. Any issues with the drives?" There was a sound on the line that he'd learned, over 2 years of working with Admiral Osei, was her version of a smile. She didn't really smile. Her face didn't do the performative things that some people's did. But there was a sound she made when something was working exactly as it should. "None," she said. "Nath says they're perfect. She keeps saying that. She's been saying it for 3 days. He thought about Priya Nath, whom he'd met exactly once, in that construction bay, and who had given him a 45-minute explanation of dark matter fold compression that he hadn't understood at all, and hadn't needed to. He'd understood what mattered, the look on her face when she talked about it, the look of someone who had built the most important thing that had ever been built, and knew it, and was more interested in the fact that it worked than in any of the consequences. "Good," Draven said. "Let them sleep 1 more night, then move them to the marker coordinates. Already en route." He paused. Outside his office's small window, Varath Station's dock ring turned slowly in the rust-colored light. Somewhere in the chamber behind him, the Sorvathi were still arguing about trade certification. "Yara," he said. He almost never used her first name. "Kale," she said back, the same tone, the same weight. That was enough. He ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of the small room that was all the Galactic Council had ever seen fit to give humanity. A corner office with a view of the dock ring and 3 chairs that were too small for human proportions, because no one had thought it worth getting the measurements right. Then he opened Taurus's file and started reading about treaties. He had 6 hours before everything changed. He used 4 of them learning exactly which rules humanity had never been required to follow. The other 2 he spent sleeping in the badly proportioned chair, which he'd taught himself to do years ago. Because patience is only a tactic if you're rested enough to use it. When the comm chimed him awake, it was Torres. "Ambassador," she said, and he could hear it in her voice, the thing he'd been waiting for her to hear. "There are signatures on the long-range grid. 17 of them. Our sensors can't—" She stopped. Tried again. "The sensors can't classify them. The signature type doesn't match anything in the registry." Of course it didn't. Nothing in the registry had ever run a dark matter fold drive before. "I know," he said. "What are they?" He stood up, straightened his jacket, checked his reflection in the dark window. Tired eyes, 11 years of a mild expression, a man who had been waiting long enough that the waiting had become part of his face. "Ours," he said. He walked back toward the chamber. The Sorvathi were still talking about trade certification when he sat back down in the human seat. 3rd row, left side, slightly behind the column, right where the architects had put humanity when they'd designed a room that never truly expected it to matter. He folded his hands. He waited. 40 light minutes away, 17 dark matter warships held their position in the dark, their drives humming at a frequency that no sensor in the known galaxy had a name for, their hulls unmarked except for a small flag painted on each one, blue and white and green, a sphere seen from space, a planet that the rest of the galaxy had never quite taken seriously. The drives breathed. The ships waited, the way their builders had waited, patiently, like they had nowhere else to be, like they had all the time in the world, like they'd been here all along. The first person to see them was a Teln sensor operator named Vassorivel, and she would spend the rest of her life being asked to describe the moment, and she would always say the same thing. She would say, "The instruments didn't alarm." That was the part people never understood when she told them. Everyone expected her to say the alarms went off, that the station filled with red light and screaming klaxons and the dramatic machinery of crisis. That was how it happened in every military training simulation. Contact with an unknown vessel, alarms, response protocols, escalation sequence. But the instruments didn't alarm because the instruments didn't know what they were looking at. An alarm requires a category. The sensor suite needed to identify what kind of thing it was seeing before it could decide whether the thing was dangerous. That process took, in normal circumstances, between 1 and 4 seconds. The signatures from 17 dark matter warships sat on Vassorivel's screen for 11 seconds, while the system tried to find a category. Then it returned an error she had never seen before in 9 years of operating council monitoring equipment. Classification failure, drive type, unknown, energy profile, no match, recommend manual review. She stared at it. She ran the scan again. The same error came back. She ran it a 3rd time with the secondary array, which operated on a different detection principle and had its own independent database. The secondary array took 4 seconds longer than the primary. Then it returned the same error. Vassorivel was a precise, methodical person who had been operating sensor equipment since she was considered a junior technician, and who had, in 9 years, flagged a total of 6 anomalies to her supervisor, all of which had turned out to be equipment glitches or misidentified debris. She thought about those 6 times while she was looking at 17 unknown signatures moving in slow, deliberate formation, 40 light minutes from the station. This was not a glitch. Glitches didn't hold formation. She reached for her supervisor's comm channel. Commander Esch received the notification in the Varrock delegation's secondary chamber, where he had gone after the recess to file the morning's session notes. He read it twice on his screen. Then he walked to the monitoring hub at the station's military coordination center, which he had access to by virtue of his rank and the Varrock delegation's standing security arrangements with council infrastructure. He walked quickly, not running. Varrock military officers did not run unless they were in physical danger, but he moved with the directional certainty of a man who has decided where he is going and does not intend to stop for anything. The monitoring hub was a circular room with screens on every wall and a central table for tactical display. It smelled like cooling equipment and recycled air. The Teln operator, he checked her name badge, Vassorivel, was standing at the central table with her supervisor, a Sorvathi mid-rank named Dovin, and 2 other operators who had been pulled in to look at the readings. They were all looking at the same thing. 17 contacts, moving, holding formation. Esch studied the energy profiles. The sensor system was still trying to classify the drive signatures, still returning errors, still producing that particular kind of data that looked like the equipment was broken but wasn't. Data that was too consistent and too coherent to be equipment failure, and too unrecognizable to be anything in the known registry. "How long have they been there?" he asked. Vassorivel checked. First detection was 42 minutes ago. The system spent 9 minutes trying to auto-classify before flagging for manual review. 42 minutes? He thought about the recess, about Draven at the window. Patience is a tactic. It's only a tactic if there's something you're being patient toward. Yes. Run the gravimetric scan, Esh said. Dovin looked at him. We ran. Run it again. Full spectrum, not the standard filter. I want to see the mass displacement readings. The operators exchanged a look that meant they thought he was doing the thing that worried people did when they were worried, and trying to look like they were doing something productive. They ran it anyway because he outranked them. The gravimetric scan came back in 30 seconds. Esh looked at the mass displacement readings. He looked at them for a long time. The ships, whatever they were not displacing mass the way any known drive type displaced mass. Most interstellar drives worked on some variant of the same principle. Generate a field, push against space-time, move. The mass displacement was always present, always measurable. The signatures were as individual as fingerprints, but they were all fingerprints of the same basic hand. These readings looked like the ships were folding space rather than pushing through it. That wasn't possible. Dark matter fold compression had been theorized for decades. The mathematics existed. The physics were sound. The engineering had been universally agreed, by every spacefaring civilization that had looked at the problem, to be somewhere between 2 and 5 centuries away from practical implementation. Esh looked at 17 ships that were, apparently, not aware of that consensus. "Get me a channel to High Arbiter von Sael," he said, "and someone find Ambassador Draven." Draven was already in the corridor outside the chamber when the aide found him. He didn't appear to have gone far during the recess. He was standing in almost the same place he'd stood before, at the window overlooking the dock ring, as though he hadn't moved at all. He probably hadn't. The aide, young, Sorvathi, visibly unsettled in the way people get when they've been running, told him he was requested in the monitoring hub, urgently. "I know," Draven said. The aide blinked. "You? How do you?" "My delegation received the sensor notification at the same time yours did." He turned from the window. "Shall we go?" The chamber called an emergency session 40 minutes later. Not because the protocol required it. The council could operate without a full emergency session for a sensor anomaly, but because von Sael called one, which was its own kind of signal. Von Sael called emergency sessions when he wanted to control the room and the narrative at the same time. He was good at both. The chamber filled faster than it usually did. The word had moved through the station in that way that important information always moved through small political communities, technically through official channels, practically through the faces people made when they walked past each other in corridors. Something had happened. Something the sensors couldn't classify. Draven sat in the human seat, 3rd row, left side, column in the way. He had a glass of water. He did not appear to have any notes. Von Sael stood at the head of the chamber with the particular stillness he used when he wanted to appear unhurried. It was a performance that would have been more convincing if his senior aide, standing 2 steps behind him, didn't look like she'd been awake for an hour on adrenaline. "The council has been made aware," von Sael began, "of an anomalous sensor contact in the outer monitoring range of Verath Station. 17 unidentified objects, moving in formation. Initial classification has not been completed." A pause that was clearly designed to carry weight. "I am inviting the delegations to be fully informed of this situation as the monitoring teams continue their analysis." He said it the way you'd describe a minor irregularity that you were fully in control of. He was not fully in control of it. Esh, from the Varrock section, watched Draven. Draven watched von Sael. "I would also note," von Sael continued, "that the monitoring team's initial assessment suggests the objects originated from the direction of," he paused, just slightly, "human-designated space." The chamber did the thing chambers do, a shift, not loud, just a reorientation of attention, like iron filings when a magnet moves. Everyone looked at the human seat. Draven took a sip of water. "Ambassador Draven." Von Sael's voice was careful in the way that a sharp thing is careful, held lightly so you don't cut yourself before you're ready to. "Does the human delegation have any information that would assist the council in identifying these objects?" It was beautifully framed. "Does the human delegation have any information?" Not an accusation, not yet. A question that gave Draven the chance to say no and look like he was hiding something, or say yes and have to explain himself, or say something evasive and look guilty of both. Draven set his glass down. Yes, he said. The chamber shifted again. This time it was louder, a ripple of sound from multiple species, translators working to keep up, the specific noise of a room full of people recalibrating. Von Sale had not expected yes. He'd expected evasion. The slight adjustment of his posture told Esh that much. The objects on your sensors, Draven said, are human vessels, 17 in number. They are operating dark matter fold drives, which is why your classification systems are returning errors. You don't have a registry entry for that drive type, because nothing has ever used one before. He said it the way you'd explain to someone that the meeting had been rescheduled. I'm happy to provide the technical specifications to your monitoring teams so they can update their databases. The chamber was very quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight. Then it wasn't quiet anymore. Von Sale spent 14 minutes not asking the question he actually wanted to ask, which was, how? Instead he asked questions around it, duration of the program, resource origin, personnel involved, as though he could triangulate to understanding without having to say out loud that something had happened that he hadn't seen coming and couldn't account for. Several other delegates asked direct questions. The Teln senior representative asked about the propulsion science. The Hervek delegate asked what the ships were armed with. The Sorvathi military liaison asked how long they had been in the current position. Draven answered all of them. The Varrock delegation said nothing and watched. Then Von Sale, finally, got to the part that mattered. This development, he said, represents a clear violation of the Varath Accords, the Outer Systems Military Limitation Treaty, the Council Armament Declaration of... It doesn't, Draven said. Quietly, without heat, Von Sale stopped. The Varath Accords govern military armament for full Council member species. The Outer Systems Military Limitation Treaty covers species with Category 5 observer status or higher. A pause, just one beat. As of this morning's session, humanity holds Category 9 observer status. Category 9 carries no military limitation provisions. He picked up his glass. We checked. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. The first silence had been surprise. This one was something else. This was the silence of a room full of very intelligent people doing the same calculations simultaneously and arriving at the same answer. The rules had been written for members. Humanity wasn't a member. Humanity had never been a member because the Council had spent 2 centuries finding polite reasons not to make them one, and the restrictions that came with membership, the obligations, the oversight, the eyes on what you were building, had never applied. The trap that had been built to contain humanity had been built around the wrong thing. You did this deliberately, Von Sale said. The careful tone was gone. Just the sentence, flat and clean. We built ships, Draven said. We built them in our space, with our resources, without violating any provision that applied to us. That we did it quietly was a practical decision, not a legal one. He looked at Von Sale directly. The mild expression had not changed. If you'd like to discuss the legal framework in more detail, my delegation has prepared documentation. We can file it formally or share it here, whichever the Council prefers. The session broke down twice. The first time was when the Sorvathi military liaison and the Teln senior representative both spoke simultaneously, and the translator system couldn't prioritize. The second time was when 3 delegates tried to call for a procedural suspension, and Von Sale overruled them, which was within his authority but clearly strained it. He wanted control of the room. He was having increasing difficulty exercising it. Esh did not speak during any of this. He was watching the tactical picture in his head instead, not the politics, the actual numbers. 17 ships. Dark matter fold drives. Fold compression meant you didn't travel through space in the normal sense. You reduced the distance between 2 points by manipulating the geometry around the ship. The tactical implications of that were not subtle. A fleet with fold drives could not be tracked between departure and arrival, could not be intercepted in transit, could not be predicted by any standard tactical modeling, because standard tactical modeling assumed that ships went from point A to point B in a line. These ships didn't go in lines. He thought about every defensive position the Council's combined military maintained in the outer systems, every choke point, every early warning array, all of it built on the assumption that faster-than-light travel still moved through detectable space. All of it, in a single morning session, obsolete. He thought about telling his senior officers, about the reports he'd need to file, about the expressions on the faces of his tactical staff when they ran the same calculation he had just run. Then he thought about Draven at the window during the recess. Patient. Waiting. Like a man who'd already played the game to its end in his head and was simply watching the board catch up. The session was suspended. Not ended. Suspended. When Von Sale determined that continuing without a recess for delegation consultation was producing more disorder than information. He framed it as procedural courtesy. It was retreat. Draven walked out of the chamber the same way he'd walked in. Esh caught up with him in the corridor, which required walking faster than he usually did, and he was aware of that and did it anyway. Draven. The human ambassador stopped, turned. You knew this morning, Esh said. When Von Sale moved the reclassification. You knew, and you didn't say anything, because the reclassification made it cleaner. Draven looked at him. Category 7 had some provisions that might have been stretched to apply, Draven said. Category 9 has none. So yes, the reclassification helped. You let him do it. I can't stop a procedural vote I'm not a member of. You didn't try. A pause, not a long one. No, Draven said. I didn't. Esh thought about that, about the patience, about a program that had run for, how long had he said? 60 years, longer than Esh had been alive. Started by people who were dead now, finished by people who had inherited the work from people they'd never met, and kept going anyway, because the thing being built mattered more than who got to see it finished. What do you want? Esh asked. The same question he'd asked in the monitoring hub, before the session, before all of it. Draven considered him for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether a question is genuine. Justice, he said, and a seat at the table, in that order. He walked away. Esh stood in the corridor for a moment, listening to the hum of the station around him, thinking about all the things the Council had never thought to watch humanity do, because it had never occurred to anyone that humanity was worth watching. 40 light minutes away, aboard the lead ship of a fleet that had no name yet, would be named later, in ceremonies that nobody had planned, because nobody had quite believed they'd get here. Engineer Priya Nath was doing what she always did when the drives were running at full power. She was listening. The dark matter fold drive had a sound when it was operating, not a sound you heard. The engineering bays were vacuum sealed and the drive cores were in chambers with 15 centimeters of insulated hull between them and anything human. But there was a vibration, carried through the ship's frame, through the deck plating, up through the soles of her boots, into her bones. She stood in the monitoring corridor outside Drive Core 3 and felt it. The rest of the ship was in a state of barely controlled electricity. She could hear it in the comm chatter, the footsteps, the way people moved with that extra speed they got when they knew something big was happening. The political staff were on their comms. The tactical crew were running scenarios. Someone had piped the council session feed onto the secondary screens in the crew lounge and people were gathering around it. Priya had looked at it once, registered that Draven was talking and seemed to be doing well, and come back to the drives. There were people for the politics part. There was only one person who understood the drives the way she understood them. Her mentor, Dr. Amara Singh, had first written the theoretical framework for dark matter fold compression 28 years ago. She'd written it in a notebook, by hand, in a research station on a rock in the outer belt, because the work was classified, and she'd developed the habit of keeping the core ideas on paper that couldn't be remotely accessed. Priya had that notebook. It was in her quarters, in a case bolted to the shelf so it wouldn't float in null G. Amara had died 11 years ago. Heart failure, sudden, during a routine medical check. She had been 57. She had never seen a drive run. Priya put her hand flat against the corridor wall and felt the vibration move through her palm, up her arm, into her chest. It works, she thought, the way she thought it 50 times a day. It works exactly like you said it would. The drive core breathed its dark matter breath, folding and unfolding space in increments so small they were invisible, keeping the ship hovering in a position that in another era would have taken constant thruster correction. Now the fold drive held them stable with the casual ease of something that had always existed and had simply been waiting to be found. The political stuff would sort itself out. Draven was good at the political stuff. She was good at this. She stood in the corridor and felt the ship breathe and thought about nothing except the extraordinary, impossible, completely real fact that they had done it, that it worked, that the mathematics she'd spent 15 years refining was currently running inside 17 vessels in the dark, beyond a rust-colored star. The comm beeped at her. Admiral Osei, Nath, status. All drives nominal. Fold stability at 100%. Core temperature across all 17 ships within acceptable range. She paused. They're perfect, Admiral. A beat on the other end of the line. So I've heard, Osei said. Something in her voice that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite pride, and was something in between the two that didn't have a clean name. Stay ready. We may be moving soon. Where? Closer, Osei said. It's time for them to see us. Priya nodded, which was useless on an audio channel, but was the correct response in her body anyway. She took her hand off the wall. She went back to watching the drives. 40 light minutes away, in a chamber that smelled like old power and recycled air, the Galactic Council was trying to understand something it had never seen before. It would take them a while. Humanity had been patient for 60 years. They could wait 40 more minutes. The briefing room on Kepler Station smelled like burnt coffee and old paper, which was remarkable because it was the year 2271, and nobody used paper anymore. But the senior officer who'd called the meeting was old enough to have grown up with it, and kept a stack of printed documents on the table in front of him out of habit and stubbornness, in roughly equal measure. Lieutenant Yara Osei was 26 years old. She had been commissioned 8 months ago. She had, in those 8 months, learned approximately how much she didn't know, which was the most important thing any young officer could learn, and the thing most of them took years to figure out. She sat in the third chair from the left in a room with 7 other junior officers and one very old admiral named Griss, who had a face like weathered concrete and eyes that had seen too many things too clearly. Admiral Griss put a file on the table. He didn't open it. He just put it there. The colony ship Meridian, he said, was lost in the Cavar border zone 14 months ago. 12,214 colonists and crew. The official report, filed with the Galactic Council and shared with Earth's government, indicates a navigational failure leading to catastrophic drive collapse. He stopped. Nobody in the room said anything, because the pause had the quality of a pause that was not inviting interruption. I'm going to show you the actual sensor data from the relay buoys in that zone, Admiral Griss said, and then I'm going to tell you what your career will look like if you tell anyone outside this room what you saw. He opened the file. Yara had gone through the data 3 times before she understood what she was looking at, and then she'd sat very still for a while. The Meridian had received a communication. That was the first thing. A broadcast from a station in the outer Cavar zone, Council-affiliated, Sorvathi-operated, monitoring traffic in the border region. The communication was a warning. Standard format, standard language. The zone ahead was restricted. Transit not authorized for non-member vessels. Please alter course. The Meridian's captain had acknowledged, had begun the course correction. The course correction took time. 12,000 people on a colony ship wasn't a fighter craft. You couldn't spin it on a point. The captain had acknowledged, had begun correcting, had sent a follow-up transmission confirming compliance. The second communication from the station had come 11 minutes later. The Meridian had been in the process of complying for 11 minutes when the second communication came. The second communication wasn't a warning. Yara had looked at the data signature for the second transmission for a long time. She'd checked it twice against the relay buoy records to make sure she was reading it correctly. She was reading it correctly. The station had fired. Not because the Meridian had failed to respond. Not because it had continued into the restricted zone. Because it had been 11 minutes and the station's automated defense protocols had a 10-minute compliance window, and somewhere in a building on that station, a timer had run out, and a system had done what it was designed to do, and 12,000 people had. She stopped that thought. She looked at the wall instead. She looked at it for a while. The Council's report, Admiral Griss said, was filed by High Arbiter von Sale's office. The navigational failure conclusion was endorsed by 3 subcommittees. The Sorvathi station's logs from that period are classified under Council Security Provision 7, which requires a full member vote to access. He folded his hands on the table. Earth does not have a vote. Someone in the room, a young man 2 seats down from Yara, whose name she would later remember was Petrov, said, "What are we supposed to do with this?" "Nothing," Admiral Griss said. "Officially." He looked at each of them in turn. His eyes stopped on Yara for slightly longer than the others. She didn't know why then. She would understand later. "You are being shown this," he said, "because you are young, and you are capable, and you are going to spend your careers in a galaxy that will not tell you the truth about what happened to that ship. I wanted at least some of you to know it." He closed the file. "Dismissed," he said. Yara walked out of the briefing room and down the corridor, and into the washroom, and stood over a sink for 3 minutes. She didn't cry. She was not, in general, someone who cried easily. She stood over the sink and breathed and looked at her own face in the mirror and thought about a ship full of people and a timer running out. Then she washed her hands and went back to work. That was the day. That was the whole day that started everything. She didn't do anything about it for 7 years. This is the part that people, later, when the story eventually came out, always found hardest to believe. 7 years of nothing. 7 years of a career that looked, from the outside, like a capable officer moving through standard progression. Promotions on schedule, good reviews, a posting to Earth's Outer Defense Forces, then a transfer to the Joint Human Council Liaison Security Unit, which gave her access to more classified material than most human officers ever saw. She was gathering information, quietly, carefully, in the way that a person gathers information when they know they have no power yet and won't until they do. She found 3 other officers who knew about the Meridian data. One of them had known for longer than she had, and had done what Admiral Griss had described, nothing, officially. He was a decade older than her, and tired in the way people get when they've been carrying something too heavy for too long. His name was Chen. He became her closest collaborator for the next 30 years, and the only person she ever told everything to. At year 7, she was a commander. At year 12, she was a captain. At year 15, she had a flag rank and a posting that gave her oversight of Earth's Outer Systems Infrastructure Program. The Infrastructure Program. That was the machine she needed. The Outer Systems Infrastructure Program was unglamorous work. It involved resource extraction, supply chain management, the logistics of keeping human colonial outposts functioning across 17 star systems. It was the kind of program that senior officials approved budgets for without reading the line items, because it was pipes and power relays and construction equipment, and nobody at the senior level wanted to spend their time thinking about pipes and power relays and construction equipment. That was very convenient. The asteroids in the outer belt were full of raw materials. The processing stations built to extract them were in places that had no strategic importance to anyone, too far from shipping lanes, too small to be worth monitoring, in the deep dark between systems where the nearest Council observation array was pointed at something else entirely. She started small, a fabrication facility here, a specialized construction unit there, research personnel brought on under infrastructure contracts, their actual work buried in documentation that would require 3 levels of audit clearance to untangle. She found Amara Singh in year 18. Dr. Singh was working at a university in Mumbai, teaching theoretical physics to students who were mostly interested in her for her published papers on space-time geometry, and mostly unaware that the work she considered most important had never been published. Yara had read the unpublished work through a contact at the research archive. She had read it 3 times. She flew to Mumbai herself. She sat across from Amara Singh in a campus office full of books and plants, and the kind of cheerful academic disorder that meant someone was genuinely thinking all the time, and she explained, carefully, with full documentation, under a security classification that Amara had to sign for before Yara would show her anything, what she was building and why. Amara had listened to the whole thing without interrupting. That was the first thing Yara had noticed about her. She listened until you were done. "You want to build the drives," Amara said. "I want to build the ships. The drives are why I'm here." Amara had looked at her, then at the documents, then out the window at the campus outside, where students were crossing a courtyard in afternoon light. "I've been waiting," Amara said, "for someone to ask me to build it for a reason that mattered." She came aboard 6 months later. The program ran for 40 years. Not smoothly. Nothing that spans 4 decades runs smoothly. There were funding crises and personnel problems and 3 separate security scares that required restructuring entire sections of the operation. There was the year that the fabrication station in the outer belt had a containment failure, and they lost 14 months of drive component work, and 2 people nearly died. There was the long stretch in the middle, years 20 through 28, when the theoretical work hit a wall that nobody could see around, and Amara spent 3 years in what she called productive frustration, which looked from the outside like a brilliant person arguing with mathematics, until the mathematics gave in. It always looked like it might not work. It always looked like that until the year it did. Year 31, a drive test on a hull 1/8 the size of the eventual warships, in a chamber carved out of an asteroid, with 6 people present including Yara, Amara, Chen, and 3 engineers who had been working the project for over a decade. The drive ran for 4 seconds. 4 seconds of fold compression, holding stable, at a ratio that the theoretical models said was impossible at that scale. Nobody cheered. Later, When people asked about that moment, all 6 of them would say the same thing. It was too big for cheering. It was the kind of moment that sat on you. You just stood there and let it sit. Amara cried, which she did not normally do, and then laughed at herself for crying, and then looked at Yara and said, 4 seconds. 4 seconds, Yara said. They were going to need a lot more than 4 seconds. But 4 seconds was proof. 4 seconds meant the rest was engineering. Amara died 8 years later. Heart failure, sudden. A routine medical check at the research station, and then she was simply gone, which was the way death worked when it didn't give any warning, which was the most honest thing about it, and also the worst. Yara stood at her memorial, a small thing, private, the people who knew the real work, and felt the specific weight of a debt that couldn't be paid. The woman who had made the drives possible was dead. The drives existed. Neither fact made the other one better or worse. They just both sat there. She gave a eulogy that didn't mention the ships because the ships were classified. She finished the ships for Amara the same way Priya Nath, who had been Amara's last graduate student, finished the drive work, because the person who started it deserved to have it completed. Year 39. The ships had hulls, 17 of them, built in sections in the deep dark and assembled in chambers, that had been expanded over decades from the original fabrication facility. They were not elegant. Military vessels rarely were. They were large and angular, and built for endurance over aesthetics, with drive cores that took up more internal volume than traditional designs because dark matter fold compression was not small work. Priya Nath had been running drive diagnostics for 3 years by then. She'd taken the last theoretical problems that Amara had left unsolved and solved them, which had taken 4 years of her early career and had required her to develop 3 new mathematical frameworks that didn't exist when she started. She'd sent Yara a message when the last one resolved. The drives are ready. All 17. Tell me when. Yara had read it standing in her office at Earth's Outer Defense Headquarters, where she had been admiral for 6 years, and where nobody looking at her career would have seen anything unusual. A long career. A good one. Competent and respected and unremarkable in the way that careers built on patience always looked unremarkable from the outside. She'd held the message for a moment. 12,214 people. A ship called the Meridian. A timer that ran out. She typed back, not yet. Wait for Draven. She'd found Draven 4 years earlier, not the way she'd found Amara. Draven hadn't needed finding. He was already in the system, already the human ambassador, already the patient man in the chair that nobody listened to. She'd approached him through Chen, who had a contact in the diplomatic corps. She'd explained everything, all of it. The Meridian, the 40-year program, the ships, the drives. Draven had listened the way Amara had listened, without interrupting, until she was done. You have the ships, he'd said. What are you waiting for? The right moment, she'd said. The moment they move first. I need it to be clean. Draven had thought about that. They'll move eventually. They always do. I know. It might take years. I've been doing this for 39 years, she'd said. I can wait. He'd nodded. The nod of a man who understood patience because he practiced it himself. When they move, she'd said, you'll know what to do on your end. Yes, he'd said, and you'll know what to do on yours. They hadn't needed to discuss it beyond that. Some understandings don't require elaboration. Now it was year 40. Admiral Yara Osei stood on the bridge of the lead ship, unnamed, still, because she hadn't let anyone name them yet, that felt like something to do after, and watched the sensor display. The council session was 4 hours old. Draven had delivered the legal framework. The ships had been confirmed as human vessels. The council was in controlled chaos. She should have felt triumphant. She'd been told by Chen, who knew her better than anyone, that she would feel triumphant, and she should let herself, because she'd earned it, and denying yourself the thing you earned was its own kind of damage. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the way you feel at the end of a very long journey, when you've finally arrived, and the place you've arrived at is real, and you're standing in it, and you are aware, acutely, of everyone who started the journey with you who didn't make it here. Admiral Griss, who had shown her the Meridian data and died 12 years ago, peacefully, in a hospital on Earth, having never known the program existed. Chen, who was alive, who was on the second ship in the formation, who had sent her a message an hour ago that said, "We did it, Yara," with no punctuation, like he'd been too tired or too full to bother. Amara, the Meridian's captain, whose name was Reyes, who had been sending a compliance confirmation when the station's timer ran out. 12,214 people who had been told, officially, that they died because of a navigational error, and whose families had been told the same thing, and who had been paid for in condolence funds dispersed through a council subcommittee that no longer existed. She stood on the bridge. She watched the sensors. She did not feel triumphant, but she felt something. She felt like a debt was closer to being paid than it had been yesterday. That would have to be enough for now. Her comm opened. Draven's voice. "Osei, the council is requesting a formal meeting, full session. They want to discuss," a pause that was not quite dry and not quite tired, and was both, "everything." "When?" "Tomorrow morning. Station time." "We'll be there," she said. "Move the fleet to Marker 2. I want them visible from the station's outer observation ring." "How visible?" She thought about a briefing room on Kepler Station, a file on a table, an old man with concrete-weathered skin and eyes that had seen too much. "All of them," she said. "Every ship. I want every species on that station to be able to look out any window and see all 17. A pause. "Understood," Draven said. She closed the comm. Behind her, her bridge crew was already moving, the quiet, efficient motion of people who had been trained for years for something and were finally doing it. Good people. Young people, most of them, who had come to the program in its later years and didn't know all of what had come before. She'd tell them eventually. Not now. Now she turned back to the sensor display and watched 17 ships move in formation through the dark, carrying the weight of everything that had been survived in order to build them, and thought about nothing in particular except the specific, irreversible fact of what had already been done. It could not be undone now. The drives ran. The ships moved. The debt was not yet paid, but it was no longer invisible. That was enough. For today, that was exactly enough. The emergency military session of the Galactic Council began at the 6th hour of station morning and was classified at the highest available security level, which meant that every delegation's intelligence personnel knew about it within 40 minutes, and the general population of Verith Station knew about it within 90. Security classifications in a building full of professional information gatherers were, in practice, suggestions. Draven was not invited to the military session because humans did not have military session access. Category 9 observer status included observer rights to open plenary and select committee hearings. Military emergency sessions were neither. He was aware of this. He had been aware of it for 11 years. He sat in the human diplomatic suite and drank coffee and read the treaty documentation that Torres had compiled and waited for someone to tell him what had been decided about him in a room he wasn't allowed to enter. Torres, who had been awake since the sensor alerts the previous evening and was operating on the particular bright-eyed alertness of someone running on adrenaline and professional terror, put a fresh cup in front of him at some point and said, "They've been in there for 3 hours." "I know." Is that a good sign or a bad sign?" "It means they're arguing," he said. "Arguing is better than agreeing." She thought about that. What would they be agreeing on? "Nothing good for us," he said. "More coffee, please." Inside the military session, High Arbiter Von Sale was not arguing. He was presenting. The distinction mattered to him. Von Sale did not argue. Argument implied uncertainty, implied that the other person might have a point worth engaging. He presented, and then he answered questions, and then the chamber reached the conclusion he had already decided they should reach, and this had been his operating mode for 60 years, and had served him without fail. He presented the situation in 4 sections. The current position of the human fleet, the technical assessment from the monitoring teams, which had spent the overnight hours analyzing every available reading from the 17 ships, and had produced a report that was full of accurate data and almost completely useless as tactical intelligence. Because accurate data about something you've never seen before tells you what it is without telling you what it can do. The legal analysis from Council, which confirmed that the human vessels had technically not violated any applicable treaty, and which Von Sale presented, in the tone of a man reading a document he found personally distasteful, and the recommended response. The recommended response was a Council unified fleet, assembled from contributions across member species, positioned at the boundary of human-designated space as a, Von Sale used the word, deterrent. He didn't use the word blockade. The word blockade had legal and historical weight that he preferred to avoid. Deterrent was cleaner. Deterrent implied that the fleet was there to prevent something from happening, rather than to stop something that was already happening, which was a distinction that existed primarily in the phrasing and not in the actual function of putting a large number of warships between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. Several delegates had questions. The Teln senior representative asked what the specific trigger conditions would be. What, exactly, were they deterring humanity from doing? Von Sale answered that the fleet's purpose was to ensure stability during a period of diplomatic tension. The Teln representative wrote something down and did not look satisfied. The Hervek delegate asked whether the unified fleet action required a formal declaration, and what the legal standing of such a declaration would be given. That no treaty humanity had violated could be named. Von Sale's legal aide answered this one, in careful language that translated roughly to, the authority existed in the Council's general security mandate, which was broad enough to cover situations the specific treaties didn't address. The Hervek delegate wrote something down, and did not look satisfied either. Then Commander Esch spoke. He did it the way he did most things, without announcing that he was about to do it, without the performative throat clearing or posture adjustment that most delegates use to signal an incoming statement. He simply spoke. I would like to present a tactical assessment, he said. Von Sale looked at him. The Varrock delegation's assessment will be noted. I'd prefer it to be heard rather than noted, Esch said. There's a difference. The chamber was quiet in the way that chambers got quiet when someone said the thing that everyone was aware of but that nobody in a position of authority had said yet. Von Sale gestured for him to continue. Esch stood. He connected his datapad to the chamber's display system. A tactical map came up. The star system, the station, the human fleet's current position, and an overlay showing the proposed Council fleet's assembly points and projected transit route. A standard unified fleet action of the scale being proposed would take 11 days to fully assemble, Esch said. Transit to the boundary of human space at standard drive speeds would take an additional 19 days, 30 days total from decision to position. He let that sit for a moment. The human vessels are currently 40 light minutes from this station, he said, using fold compression drives, which means they are currently 30 days from any position in the known galaxy. Simultaneously, he paused. A blockade of human space assumes that human space is a fixed location that can be blocked. I am suggesting to this chamber that this assumption is incorrect. The room was doing math. Esch continued. The Council fleet, once assembled, would be positioned at a fixed point. The human fleet can be anywhere before our fleet has completed assembly. They can be multiple places before our fleet reaches their designated position. There is no point in this galaxy where the Council fleet, using standard drives, could be guaranteed to intercept a vessel using fold compression. He looked at the tactical map. A blockade requires the ability to block. I do not believe we have that ability. I believe the action being proposed is theater. Von Sale's expression did something complicated. Commander Esch's assessment is appreciated. The Council's response must nonetheless signal. I understand what it must signal, Esch said. I am telling you what it cannot do. The distinction matters when the other side knows the difference. And you believe the humans know the difference. Esch thought about Draven at the window, patient, waiting, the man who had let his status be downgraded because it made the next move cleaner. Yes, he said. I believe they know exactly what we can and cannot do. I believe they have known for some time. The silence after that was not comfortable. Von Sale called the vote anyway. It passed. Not unanimously. The Teln delegation abstained. The Hervek delegate voted against. Two smaller species whose names didn't often appear in major session votes chose this moment to appear. Also against. But it passed. The Council unified fleet would assemble. 30 days to position. Esch filed his formal dissent through the Varrock delegation's records and said nothing further in the session. Afterward, walking back through the station corridors, he composed a message to his senior tactical officers. Not orders. A question. He asked them to run the fold compression scenarios he'd described in the session. All of them. Full tactical modeling. And tell him what they found. He already knew what they'd find. He wanted it in writing. Draven received word of the session's outcome from Torres, who had a contact in the station's administrative staff who had a contact in the session support personnel, which was the kind of information chain that took years to build and was worth every year. Unified fleet, 30 days to assemble, moving to blockade position. He read it, set his coffee down. He sent a message to Admiral Osei. They voted the fleet, 30 days, move to secondary position and hold. Osei's reply came in under 2 minutes. Already moving. Draven, the files. Is it time? He looked at the message for a moment. The files. He had copies of the Meridian sensor data, the relay buoy recordings, the transmission logs, the station's automated defense sequence, all of it, in 4 separate encrypted archives. He'd received them from Osei 4 years ago when she'd brought him into the program. He'd been carrying them since, in the particular way you carry something that has weight without volume, that occupies space in your thinking without taking up space anywhere you can point to. He'd been waiting to know when. Osei had told him, when they move first, when it's clean. The Council had just assembled a fleet to blockade human space in response to humanity building ships that violated no applicable law. That was first. That was clean. He typed back, "Yes, it's time." The files went out at the 9th hour of station morning. Not to Council leadership, not to the High Arbiter's office, not through the formal diplomatic channels that the Council could slow or redirect or simply fail to process for weeks while their legal team found reasons to suppress. The files went to every species public information network simultaneously, the civilian channels, the academic archives, the independent news systems that operated outside Council editorial oversight, the Teln Public Library Network, which was the most comprehensive information repository in the known galaxy, and had a philosophical commitment to preservation that meant once something was in it, it stayed. The Varrock Defense Intelligence Community, because Draven had a separate copy formatted specifically for them and Esh had given him, very quietly, over a lunch that happened to occur near enough to a data transfer point, a contact address. The files contained everything. The Meridian's full flight record, the warning transmission, the captain's compliance acknowledgement, the 11 minutes of active course correction, the second transmission, the station's automated defense log showing the timer expiry, the energy signature of the weapon discharge, the Meridian's final recorded data before its systems went offline, and the Council report, the official one, filed by Von Sale's office, the navigational failure conclusion, the 3 subcommittee endorsements, both documents, side by side. No commentary, no framing statement, no argument, just the 2 documents and the 11-minute gap between the compliance acknowledgement and the weapon discharge, which spoke for itself in a language that required no translation. Draven filed a formal diplomatic notice with the Council simultaneously, informing them of the release and its contents. Procedure required this. He was aware that they would want to suppress it. He was equally aware that it was already in the Teln Library Network, and there was not a force in the galaxy that had ever successfully removed something from the Teln Library Network. He sat back. He waited. The reaction came in waves. The first wave was internal to the station. Delegates contacted by their home governments contacted by their populations, the information spreading outward at the speed of whatever communication system each species used. The Teln response was fastest because the Teln public network had no editorial delay. The data had simply arrived and been indexed, and was now available to every Teln with a reading device, which was all of them. The second wave was the political one. 3 delegations formally requested an emergency plenary session. Von Sale's office issued a statement calling the release unauthorized and inflammatory, which was technically accurate on the first count, and accurate on the second in ways his office probably didn't intend. The third wave was the one that mattered. It came from the small species, the ones whose names appeared rarely in major sessions. The Hervek, who sent Draven a formal diplomatic acknowledgement within 2 hours. Not commentary, just acknowledgement, but the fact of it said what they chose not to. Several others whose delegates had voted against the fleet. A species called the Feln Aura, who occupied 3 systems in a border region and had been petitioning the Council for full membership for 40 years, and kept being told to wait. The Feln Aura ambassador sent Draven an encrypted personal message. It said, "We knew something like the Meridian had happened to your people. We had our own version, 30 years ago. Different ship, different station, same timer." Draven read it 3 times. He sent back, "I know. We're going to need to talk." The Council fleet in the meantime had begun its assembly. 5 species contributed vessels in the first 12 hours, the Sorvathi, 2 of the larger allied species, and 2 others whose participation seemed more political than tactical, a way of being visible in a room where not choosing a side was itself a choice. The Varrock contribution had not materialized. Esh's dissent was formal and on record, and his senior command appeared, based on the fleet assembly data, to be treating it as guidance. The Teln contributed nothing, and issued no statement. The Hervek issued a statement that carefully avoided the words, "We are not contributing," while conveying the information clearly. The assembling fleet, by the end of the first day, was smaller than Von Sale's proposal had outlined. Still significant, still a message, but the message was coming through a channel with less signal than he'd expected. Osei watched the fleet assembly data from the bridge of the lead ship. The human vessels had moved to secondary position, further from the station, technically further from anything the Council would consider strategically important, a position that looked like caution and functioned as patience. They were visible on long-range sensors. Anyone looking could find them. She'd ensured that. Chen's voice came over the private command channel. They're not going to send the full fleet. No, she said. The Meridian files. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Do you think it'll matter? To them? To the Council's core members? The Sorvathi and their allies? Do you think knowing changes anything for them? Osei thought about it honestly. No, she said. Von Sale knows what he did. He knew before we released anything. Knowing doesn't change people like that. Then why release it? She looked at the sensor display, the small fleet assembling, the notable absences in it. Because the Tel know, she said, and the Hervek know, and every species that's been sitting in that observer tier, watching the powerful ones make decisions, they know now too. And that's a different room than it was yesterday. Chen was quiet again. Then, Yara, the Felnora. I know. They're Meridian. 30 years ago. I know. How many more do you think there are? She didn't answer that. Not because she didn't have a number. She had a number, or the beginning of one, assembled from pieces of information gathered over 40 years of reading everything she could find. But because saying it out loud in this moment felt like opening a door she wasn't ready to walk through yet. One thing at a time. Get me a channel to Commander Esch, she said. Chen paused. The Varrock? He sent his descent. His fleet isn't in the assembly. I want to talk to him. Is that... Chen stopped himself, started again. Is that wise? It's necessary, she said. Whether it's wise is a different question. The channel took 4 minutes to establish. Esch's face appeared on the secondary display, gray-green, steady, those dark reflective eyes carrying whatever they always carried, which Osei had learned in 2 minutes of reading his record was a very specific kind of intelligence that never announced itself. Admiral, he said. Commander, thank you for taking the call. I wasn't certain you'd ask for one. You dissented, she said. You told the truth in that room when it was inconvenient. That earns a call. He looked at her for a moment. The Meridian files. Yes. Von Sale is going to claim they're fabricated. He'll try, she said. The relay buoy data has a cryptographic timestamp that predates his office's official report by 9 months. His legal team will argue about it for a year. But the Teln Library has it now, which means it'll be in their historical record in perpetuity, regardless of what any legal team argues. Esch was quiet, processing. She gave him the time. What do you want, Admiral? He said. The same question he'd asked Draven. She understood now that it was his real question, the one underneath everything else, the one that cut to what mattered. A real seat at the council table, she said. Full membership, voting rights, access. Not Category 9, not observer status, membership. And the accounting? She looked at him. You read the transcript of Draven's conversation. Yes. Then you know the second part. Von Sale's office filed a false report that classified the deaths of 12,000 people as a navigational accident. That requires a formal inquiry. Not a subcommittee review, an independent tribunal. Esch was quiet again. If I support this, he said carefully, I am not simply dissenting from a fleet action. I am moving against the current senior leadership of the council. That has implications for the Varrock delegation's position. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to fall on a sword. What are you asking? She looked at him through the screen. Thousands of kilometers of space between them, and a conversation that felt closer than most she'd had in the same room. I'm asking you to be in the room when it matters, she said. That's all. Just be in the room. He held her gaze. I'm already in the room, he said. I have been since the session. She nodded once. Good, she said. She closed the channel. Outside, through the observation port at the side of the bridge, stars sat in their ancient positions, unchanging, indifferent to what the small creatures in the ships below them were deciding. The council fleet was assembling somewhere in the dark, smaller than it should have been, moving slower than its designers intended. Draven was in a room on the station doing what he did best, which was understanding exactly how much ground had shifted under everyone's feet, and being the only person in the room who'd expected it. The files were in the Teln network. 12,214 names were, for the first time, attached to a true account of what had happened to them. Osei sat in the captain's chair of a ship that had no name yet, and thought that she should probably decide on a name soon. The fleet would need names. They were real now, not a secret program, not a project in the dark. They were a fleet. Fleets had names. She thought about the Meridian. She thought the first ship would carry that name. The lead vessel, the one she stood on, the one whose dark matter drives had breathed their first full breath 40 light minutes from a station full of people who hadn't expected it. The Meridian. Not as mourning, not as wound-carrying, as a record. A correction to the official version. Proof that the name survived even when the Council's report said it died of navigational error. She would recommend it to the Fleet Naming Committee, which did not yet exist, because nothing about this had been planned far enough ahead to include naming committees. She made a note. Then she went back to watching the sensors and the assembling fleet and the slow, patient movement of a situation that had been building for 40 years and was now, finally, in the part where things happened quickly. She was ready for quickly. She'd had a lot of practice being ready. The formal session was held on the 14th day, not the 30th. The Council fleet had not finished assembling by the 14th day, was, in fact, still missing the contributions of 6 species who had not formally refused to contribute and had not formally agreed and were existing in that particular diplomatic space where you do nothing loudly enough that it becomes a position. But Von Sale had called the session anyway, because 14 days of the Meridian files sitting in the Teln library and spreading through every connected network in the known galaxy was 14 days of his office issuing statements that nobody believed, and a man who had built his authority on controlling rooms understood when a room was getting away from him. Better to call the session than to let the session call itself. Draven was given a temporary full access pass for the proceedings. Torres brought it to him in the suite, a physical credential on a lanyard, the way the Council issued things when it wanted the issuance to feel formal. She held it out. He took it. He looked at it for a moment. 11 years of the observer tier, the column that partially blocked his sightline, the chair sized wrong for human proportions because no one had thought the measurements worth getting right. Ambassador, Torres said. Yes. Are you all right? He put the lanyard over his head, straightened his jacket. I'm fine, he said. Let's go. He sat in the main floor seating for the first time. Not the observer tier, the floor, the seats arranged in the curved formation around the central speaking position, where every voting delegation sat, where the light was better, and the sight lines were clear, and the chairs, he noticed immediately, were sized correctly for him. Someone had changed the chair. He didn't know when. Some station maintenance worker had swapped the chair during the 14 days, quietly, without announcement, which was either a gesture of respect or an administrative correction, and possibly both simultaneously. He sat in it. It fit. He looked at the chamber from this angle for the first time. The ceiling still went 40 meters. The pale blue walls still carried their particular glow. It was the same room. From here it looked different, not because anything about it had changed, but because the position changed what you saw. He thought about all the things he hadn't been able to see from the third row, left side, behind the column. He thought, I'll have to learn this room all over again. The session opened with procedural statements that took 40 minutes. Draven listened to them with the same patient attention he'd given 11 years of procedural statements from a worse chair. Then Von Sale spoke. He was not diminished. Draven had expected, or perhaps hoped, for some visible marking of the 14 days on the man's bearing, some slippage in the authority, the composure, the 60-year habit of absolute certainty. There was none. Von Sale stood at the central position with the same loose confidence he always carried, and he spoke in the same ornate, measured cadence that meant he'd decided exactly what he intended to say, and was saying it, and not one word else. He acknowledged the Meridian files, formally, in the record. He did it the way you acknowledge something that has happened to you rather than something you did, as an event that had occurred, that had caused understandable concern, that the Council took seriously and would address through proper investigative channels. He used the word regrettable. He used the phrase full accounting. He used the word process 3 times in 4 sentences. He did not say, we knew. He did not say, my office filed a document that called 12,000 deaths a navigational error. He did not say anything that couldn't be argued around later. Draven listened to all of it without expression. When it was his turn to speak, he stood. The chamber felt different when you stood in it from the floor. The 40-meter ceiling was still tall, but it wasn't oppressive. It was just a ceiling. The pale blue walls were just walls. The human delegation accepts the Council's acknowledgement, he said, and formally requests that the investigative process be conducted by an independent tribunal, with no voting members, drawn from the current senior leadership structure. He paused one beat. We also request that the tribunal's scope include any similar incidents involving non-member species in the past century. We believe the Meridian may not be unique. He sat down. The Feln Aura delegate across the chamber looked at him. A small nod, almost invisible. He didn't nod back. He didn't need to. The vote on full human membership took 3 hours of debate. Not because the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The Meridian files had done their work, and the political landscape of the chamber was not the same one that had reclassified humanity to Category 9 14 days ago. But the Council's procedures required debate, and several delegations used the debate time to say things for the record that they wanted said, and some of those things were about the Meridian, and some were about the fleet, and one Teln senior representative gave a 12-minute address about the foundational principles of the Council that was technically about humanity's membership, and was actually about the Sorvathi block's stranglehold on Council leadership, and everyone in the room understood this, including the Sorvathi. When the vote came, it passed. Not unanimously. Von Sale's block voted against, or abstained, in numbers that were large enough to be noted, and small enough to be irrelevant. Humanity was a full member of the Galactic Council. 200 years after first contact, 14 days after 17 dark matter warships woke up in the dark 40 light minutes from a station that had never quite believed it needed to take them seriously. The chamber recorded the vote. An aide announced it formally. The procedural language was read into the official record. Draven sat in his correctly sized chair on the main floor and felt the vote happen around him. He had imagined this moment. Not often. He wasn't someone who spent much energy on imagining futures that weren't guaranteed, but occasionally, in the quiet of the badly proportioned office with the view of the dock ring, he had let himself imagine it, what it would feel like. He had imagined something larger. The actual feeling was quieter, not disappointment, nothing so simple, more like the way a sound stops and you become aware of how long you'd been hearing it. 11 years of the observer tier, 200 years of his species in that chair. It had been a weight, that position, not dramatic but constant, the way bad posture is constant. Something you adjust around until you can't remember adjusting. Now it was gone. He sat in the correct chair and felt the absence of the weight, and understood that absence was its own adjustment. Torres, beside him, was not attempting to conceal the fact that her eyes were wet. He appreciated that she wasn't attempting to conceal it. It seemed like the right response. He wasn't going to tell her that. Von Sale found him in the corridor during the recess that followed. Not a coincidence. The man did not do corridor encounters by coincidence. He had chosen this hallway, this timing, this specific version of the apparently casual approach. Draven waited. Ambassador, Von Sale said, the title landing differently now. Full member, voting rights, a different weight to the word than it had carried yesterday. High Arbiter. Von Sale walked beside him. They moved down the corridor at the unhurried pace of two men with somewhere to be and the mutual decision to get there slowly. You've achieved something significant, Von Sale said. The membership, the fleet, the files. He said it without visible rancor, which was its own kind of impressive. I want you to understand what you have achieved, fully. I believe I understand it. You've made your species the most dangerous thing in this galaxy. He said it conversationally, as though discussing weather. Not the most powerful, not yet, but the most dangerous. Because you have demonstrated that humanity will spend 60 years building something in secret rather than ask for what it wants openly. That is not a comfortable thing to be known for. Draven walked 3 steps before he answered. We asked openly, he said. For 200 years, we asked for membership. We asked for a seat. We asked for an inquiry into the Meridian, openly, through proper channels. We were told to wait. He glanced at Von Sale. We waited. We just didn't wait empty-handed. Von Sale was quiet. You've made the rest of the galaxy afraid of you, he said. That is not the same as making them respect you. No, Draven agreed. It's not. But it's a start. They reached the end of the corridor. Von Sale stopped. Draven took 2 more steps, and then stopped as well, and turned. The High Arbiter looked at him with 60 years of authority in his posture, and something behind it that was not quite what it had been 14 days ago. The tribunal, Von Sale said. It will find what it finds. Yes, Draven said. It will. He walked away. He did not look back. The journalist found Priya Nath in the engineering observation bay of the ship that was now officially named the Meridian. The naming had been quick, almost informal. Osei had recommended it, and the Fleet Naming Committee, which had existed for 6 days, had agreed without objection. The journalist was from an independent Teln news network, and had been given access to the human fleet as part of the new membership arrangements, which included media protocols that hadn't existed last month. She was thorough and precise in the way Teln journalists tended to be, and she had already spoken to Admiral Osei and Ambassador Draven and Commander Chen and 17 other personnel before she found Priya, who had not been avoiding her exactly, but had not been making herself easy to find. She asked the question everyone wanted answered. "What does it feel like," she asked, "to have built the most powerful warships in known space?" Priya was running a diagnostic on the drive monitoring system when she asked it. She didn't stop running the diagnostic. She thought about the question honestly, the way she thought about all questions, not performing consideration but actually doing it, turning the question over to see what it actually was. "I built engines," she said. "I built them because my mentor started them and didn't get to finish, and because the math was the most interesting problem I'd ever seen, and because when I first understood what fold compression could do, I couldn't not finish it." She looked at the monitoring screen. All 17 drives running nominal, all 17 heartbeats steady. What they mean, what they are politically, strategically, historically, that's someone else's department. I just wanted to know if they'd work. Did you know they would? She thought about that too. "I knew the math was right," she said. "Math being right and the thing working are related, but not the same. There's always the first test, the 4 seconds." She paused. "I knew after 4 seconds." The journalist asked about Dr. Singh. Priya's hands paused on the diagnostic panel. "Just briefly. Just one beat." "She was right about everything," Priya said. "She knew she was right. She just didn't get to see it." She went back to the diagnostic. The journalist, who was thorough and precise, and apparently also perceptive, understood that the interview was over. Admiral Osei's ship left the fleet formation at the 16th day. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She filed a course notation with the fleet's navigation coordinator, standard procedure, required. But she didn't explain it, and nobody asked her to. She was the admiral. Explanations were optional. The Meridian traveled alone for 11 hours. She arrived at a set of coordinates in the Kavar border zone. The relay buoys were still there. Older now, 40 years of slow drift. Their positions adjusted slightly from where they'd been in the original sensor data. She'd corrected for that in the navigation. There was debris. Not much. 40 years of space did things to debris. Dispersed it, scattered it, sent pieces on long, slow orbits that carried them further from the original point every year. But there was enough. Hull fragments. What had once been internal structure, pieces that the sensors could confirm were consistent with a colonial transport class vessel of the Meridian's era. She brought the ship to a full stop. She did not make an announcement to the crew. They knew where they were. The ship's name was sufficient explanation. She sat in the captain's chair and looked at the debris field on the sensor display. She stayed there for 6 hours. The crew stayed quiet. Whatever they were doing, maintenance, rest rotations, the ordinary operational business of a ship that had somewhere to be, they did it without the usual ambient noise of a working vessel. Not ordered silence, just chosen. She thought about Admiral Griss. She thought about the briefing room that smelled like burnt coffee. She thought about standing over a sink in a washroom breathing until she could go back to work. She thought about 12,214 people who had been 11 minutes into complying with a warning when the timer ran out. She thought about Amara Singh, who had made the drives and never seen them run. She thought about the 4 seconds. She thought about Chen's message, "We did it, Yara," with no punctuation. She thought about the correctly sized chair. She thought about Von Sale saying, "You've made your species the most dangerous thing in this galaxy." She thought, "You made us that. You did it 40 years ago with a timer and a weapon, and a report that called it a navigational error. We just took 40 years to catch up to what you'd already decided we were." After 6 hours, she told the navigation officer to set course back to Vareth Station. She didn't look at the debris field on the sensors as they left. She'd seen it. It was in her now. That was enough. The message from the unknown species arrived on the 18th day. It came through standard diplomatic channels, the new human diplomatic channels, the full member ones with proper encryption and routing, and it was addressed to the human delegation, attention Ambassador Draven. The sender identifier was a species designation that appeared in the Council's contact registry as Category 12, which was below Category 9, which meant a species so early in its interstellar development that contact protocols were still being established. Category 12, pre-membership, pre-contact formalization, a species that, by the Council's own classification, was barely on the galaxy's radar. Draven opened it. 2 sentences. We saw what you did. We have been waiting for someone to do it for a long time. He read it twice. He sat back in his chair, his new chair, in his new office, which was larger than the old one, and had a view of something other than the dock ring, though he hadn't fully registered what the view was yet because he'd been too busy to look at it properly. He thought about the Felnora, 30 years ago. Different ship, different station, same timer. He thought about how many species existed in the known galaxy at various stages of development, various observer categories, various distances from the table where decisions were made. He thought about the Category 12 species, wherever they were, watching the Meridian files spread through every network the Telm library touched, and understanding something that 40 years of diplomatic patience had never communicated, that it was possible. That you could be small and ignored and categorized and managed, and still, if you were patient enough and serious enough, and willing to spend 60 years doing the quiet, unglamorous work of building something in the dark, you could make the room change. He didn't forward the message to anyone. Not yet. He held it in the same way you hold something that has weight without volume, the thing that occupies space in your thinking. He'd been carrying the Meridian files that way for 4 years. He'd been carrying 11 years of the wrong chair. He'd been carrying, if he was honest, the particular weight of being the person in the room who knows the punchline and has to wait for the setup to finish. He was good at carrying things. He read the message a 3rd time. We saw what you did. We have been waiting for someone to do it for a long time. Outside the window of his new office, he looked at it now, properly, for the first time. Varath Station's outer ring turned in the light of its rust-colored star. Ships moved along the dock approaches. The Council's infrastructure, enormous and old and built over centuries, went about its ordinary operations with the vast indifference of things that expect to continue existing. It would continue existing. But it was not the same thing it had been 18 days ago. Rooms don't look different when the power in them shifts. The ceiling stays 40 meters. The walls stay pale blue. The light comes from everywhere and nowhere and makes everyone look slightly holy. But something changes, something below the visible, something in the way the air sits. Draven had spent 11 years in that room learning to read it. He was going to have to learn it all over again. He thought, good. He closed the message. He pulled up Torres's latest brief on the tribunal formation, the independent body that would investigate the Meridian, and whatever else it found, and whatever else after that, because he had a strong suspicion that the Felnora were not going to be the only ones, and the tribunal's scope was written broadly, and he had written it broadly on purpose. He started reading. Outside, the station turned. The rust-colored star held its position in the dark, as it had for 5 billion years, indifferent to the very small and very consequential things happening in its orbit. Somewhere 40 light-minutes away, 17 dark matter warships held their formation, their drives breathing at a frequency the galaxy still didn't have a name for, patient and present and real in the way that only things built over decades of quiet, serious work ever managed to be real. The Meridian was among them. Its name was in the record now, the true record, the one that didn't call it an error.